In the last few lectures, we spent time looking at some of the traditional arguments for and against theism. So we looked at the ontological argument, the teleological argument, the cosmological argument, and then we considered the problem of evil. And for this lecture, we're going to be diving more deeply into the ideas of divinity and the notion of ultimate reality. And so to begin, I thought it might be helpful to first talk about maybe some of the benefits of the traditional arguments that we just covered, how they are beneficial either personally or also even philosophically, and then what additional work we might need to do when thinking about the nature of God, the nature of divinity, and the nature of ultimate reality. So if we ask the question, in what ways are the traditional arguments for and against God useful? Well, the obvious first answer is that these arguments can either confirm or disconfirm the existence of God. That is, if you find any of the arguments persuasive. So if you're a theist and you think that the teleological argument is a good argument, well, that provides some justification for your belief in theism. Likewise, if you're an atheist, maybe the ability to refute those arguments might strengthen your atheistic convictions, or maybe it's the problem of evil that confirms that stance. And so in those ways, these arguments could be useful. But I think there are other ways that these arguments are useful generally in the area of philosophy, and that is that they clarify the nature of ultimate reality. Specifically, they bring up these distinctions between, say, necessity and contingency. So are there such things as necessary realities? And if so, what exactly is it about those realities that are distinguished from contingent realities? And the traditional arguments help us get at that basic philosophical distinction. And it also helps us think through the difference between the idea of a personal creator versus the idea of impersonal cause and effect. So when we're thinking about this idea, we're trying to think about what forces in the reality that we live in govern that reality. What are the forces that govern reality? Is there some sort of personal God that is providentially in control of all things? And if so, what does that providence look like? Or are we living in a completely materialistic, natural universe where everything is operating according to impersonal laws of nature, impersonal cause and effect? And that distinction really comes out in an examination of these traditional arguments. But of course, further questions arise. So once you get past those initial generalizations and you work through the traditional arguments for God, the questions are, well, now what can we say about God's moral character if God in fact exists? Or what can we say about God's power and knowledge? To answer these questions, we dive into specific religious and worldview traditions. And so that's what we're going to be doing in this lecture. And to start off, it might be good to have just a basic overview of four distinct worldviews. Now, these worldviews, I think, are just helpful for looking at the various religious traditions and some non-religious traditions as well, um, and having some sort of framework to put these traditions into. So the first one on your screen is the naturalist position, which is also very similar to the pantheist position. So we might call it naturalistic or pantheistic monism. This is the idea that what's ultimately real at the end of the day. So our understanding of ultimate reality as a naturalist is to say that the cosmos is all that is. And if you're a pantheist, you would say something similar, although you might use religious language to describe the cosmos. And so we'll talk about that here in a moment. The next position on divinity and ultimate reality is what's called theism or theistic dualism. And we're going to look at two versions of that. We're going to look at traditional theism versus deism. But this notion says that there is a God that exists, and this God exists outside of the creation. So now we're not just talking about the cosmos. What we call the cosmos is we say the cosmos or the universe is God's creation. God is distinct from the cosmos, which means that God exists out of time, outside of time, outside of matter, outside of space. God is a different type of being than the creation. Furthermore, God would be what's ultimately real in this worldview, and God brings a material universe into existence, and that material universe is called the creation. In panentheism, so don't mistake that with pantheism. This is panentheism. It's a worldview that says that the mind of God is really, God is the mind of the cosmos, I guess you would say. So we live in a physical cosmos, but as the cosmos developed, God became sort of the mind of that cosmos. And so the panentheism is pan is for all, en is for in, all is in God. And when you're thinking about these worldviews, you can actually think about some distinctions between a problem in philosophy that's sometimes called the mind-body problem. And these worldview distinctions really parallel the traditional mind-body problem. In the mind-body problem, you have naturalism or materialism would argue that the brain is the only thing that exists, and there is no mind that exists separately from the brain. Whereas you could have mind-body dualism, which says we have a mind that's separate from our brain or from our body. And then there's panentheism in worldview terms. But when it comes to the mind-body problem, that's a view called epiphenomenalism that says that we have a mind that is distinct from our brain, but our brain is given off conscious thoughts. So that is similar to the panentheist view. Now, the fourth category that we'll consider is what's called idealistic monism. And this is the idea that we are living in one world, so it's not a dualistic way of thinking about the world. God is not separate from the creation. Rather, everything we view around us is God. God is all that exists, and we exist inside the consciousness of God. And so we'll take a few moments to look at each of these worldviews in a little more detail, starting with naturalistic monism. So naturalistic monism is best explained, I think, in this phrase by the late Carl Sagan, who said that the cosmos is all that is, all that was, and all that ever will be. This is a good, concise statement of what the naturalist position is. There is nothing that exists outside the cosmos, which means that if you ask what is reality, if we were in class and I had a whiteboard where I could draw the naturalist view, I would draw a circle, and that circle would say reality inside of it, and I would just put an equal sign under that and put cosmos right under that. Reality equals the cosmos, which means anything that's outside of the cosmos is something that is not reality. It's not real, which means it's nothing. The cosmos is all that is, all that was, all that ever will be. And so if you ask, how does the cosmos function? We'll put in the simplest of terms, we live in a material universe. So there's mass, time, space, energy. All of that is considered to be material in the way that I'm speaking. And this cosmos is developing through material cause and effect. Meaning, when we think about how causes happen in the world, you have material objects plus natural laws. So we've talked about this a little bit when we were in class, but this simple illustration that I like to always go back to is talking about playing pool. So when we're playing pool, if I hit the cue ball and the cue ball hits the 8-ball and the 8-ball goes in the side pocket, if you ask what caused the 8-ball to go into the side pocket, well, the simple answer is to say that the cue ball caused the 8-ball to go into the side pocket. Well, when you're thinking about it that way, what you're saying is that there was a material object, that is the cue ball, caused another material object, the 8-ball, to move into the side pocket. But of course, that's not a full explanation for how cause and effect works. You have to add something to that because the cue ball was not really the thing that caused the 8-ball to move. It was the state that the cue ball was in. And the way that you would explain that state is by some appeal to natural laws. And so we could look at just basic laws of physics. So if we could lay out all the factors that were involved in the state of motion that the cue ball was in, we could give physical numbers that explain the state that it was in. And it's really the state that the cue ball's in plus the material object of the cue ball that caused the 8-ball to go into the side pocket. And so a naturalistic universe just functions according to material objects are moving according to natural laws, and that's all that exists. That explains everything that we see here in the moment. Now we could look at another worldview that is, again, virtually identical to the naturalist perspective, and that's pantheistic monism. So you would find pantheistic monism in the Hindu tradition. So we'll briefly look at Hindu pantheism. But it's also a worldview that's consistent with different forms of Buddhism, Confucianism. These are the worldview commitments of those worldviews or world religions. And in Hindu pantheism, you have this famous statement that Atman is Brahman. And these explain the world that we live in, the reality that we live in. Atman in Hindu pantheism is the essence or the soul of any person. Now, we have to make sure we understand what the word soul means here. So soul in Hindu pantheism doesn't mean the same thing that soul might mean in, say, Christian theism, where in many versions of Christian theism, the soul is distinct from the body. So you have a soul in Christian theism that is immaterial. It can't be reduced to the physical brain or the physical body. And so your soul is distinct from your body, and somehow the soul and the body is working together. That's not what is meant by the soul in the Hindu tradition. The body and the soul are indistinguishable. And when we talk about Atman, we're talking about the essence of what it means to be a person. But they're not thinking in a dualistic way. They're thinking very much in a monistic way. There's only one thing, one essence. And the phrase that Atman is Brahman is to compare the human person, the human soul, with the essence or the soul of the whole cosmos. And so Brahman is the essence of the whole cosmos. And so to say that Atman is Brahman is to say that there's really no distinction between us and the world that we live in. Well, that is a more religious way of talking about naturalism. So if you ask, what is the difference between pantheism and naturalism? Well, from a worldview perspective, pantheism and naturalism are virtually indistinguishable. They're the same worldview, although the way a pantheist, specifically a Hindu pantheist, will talk about Atman and Brahman, the language is different than how, say, Carl Sagan would talk, but the worldview that's being presented is virtually indistinguishable. So that's naturalism and pantheism. And now we turn to theistic dualism. So I call it a dualist worldview because God is distinct from the cosmos. God is distinct from the creation. You have other forms of dualism that we could talk about, such as in the Platonic tradition. So in Plato's philosophy, he has a dualism that distinguishes the realm of the forms with the realm of the particulars. The particulars are the physical things that we see around us, whereas the realm of the forms are the concepts of the particular things that we see. So in Plato's thought, you might see a particular table in front of you, but there's also a concept of table that you can imagine, even if there's no tables in the room. Well, in theism, the dualist worldview here is that there is God, and God is a mind that's immaterial, that is distinct from the physical cosmos, and God is the one who brings a creation into existence. Now, there are three major theistic traditions, monotheistic traditions, and that would be Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I'm going to just consider Christianity here because I'm guessing that most of you are most familiar with the Christian tradition, but there's certainly views that are parallel Christian theism, both in Judaism and Islam. And in this theistic tradition, you have Genesis 1, which, I mean, Christians and Jews both share this sacred text. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Well, this statement represents the theistic worldview. So God is in the beginning, God is ultimate reality, and God creates a reality that's distinct from God. So you can't say that creation and God are the same thing in this particular worldview. We could look at a few other religious texts. So John 1, 1 through 3, we read that in the beginning was the Word. The Greek word for this is logos, and so many within Christian philosophy have said that God is logical, rational. God is the Word. So we have a reasoning God within the Christian tradition. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made. So God is the one who is the Word. And actually, if you go through the book of Genesis, God speaks the creation into existence. And so there actually is, there are some Christian traditions that say that when you look at the created world, there's something about the created world that has some speech to it. In the Hebrew Bible, you have in the Psalms that the heavens declare the glory of God. So the heavens are declaring things, speaking words. And so that tells you from a theistic conception how one might view the creation. And then you have another text, Hebrews 1, 1 through 3, that reads that Jesus is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and upholds the universe by the word of his power. Now, this gets into some distinctions within specifically a Christian theistic worldview, where this hints at the notion of the Trinity. Now, in this case, Jesus would be somebody who's equivalent with God. And later on in Christian history, this gets developed into the idea that the Father is God, the Son is God, and the Holy Spirit is God. But that's something that we're not going to be diving into at this point. But this is all part of the theistic tradition. Another very similar tradition is deism. Now, the main distinction between deism and theism, so if we just go back a slide, we can see this again. On theism, you can notice the lines that are coming down from God to the creation. So this is meant to represent that God can interact with the created order. On deism, however, God and nature are still distinct, so it's still a dualistic worldview, but on deism, God does not interact with the world. So this is sometimes called the watchmaker view of God, where God creates a mechanical universe. So God is still the creator within this worldview, but after God creates it, he kind of sets up the creation to run on its own. And so God exists but does not interact with the world, much like a watchmaker might interact with a watch. After the watchmaker makes the watch, he winds it up and lets it go, and then the watch just operates on its own. So the watchmaker isn't constantly making the watch move and isn't intervening at any time. Once the system's set up, the system moves, and that is the deistic worldview. The next position is panentheism, or all-in-Godism, is what panentheism means. Now, most panentheists come from the Christian faith tradition, and this movement has a history that really develops significantly in the 20th century. So it develops alongside of what's called process theology, which we'll look at here in a moment. But the panentheists refer to classical theism as the god of the philosophers. And one of the reasons for doing this is many panentheists will claim that the way most people think of classical theism today was influenced by a theologian named Thomas Aquinas. And they would point out that Thomas Aquinas was very much influenced by the philosopher Aristotle. And so what Aquinas was doing, perhaps unknowingly, now different panentheists will maybe have different perspectives on this, but Aquinas was unknowingly bringing Aristotle into a Christian framework and maybe uncritically just adopting that framework rather than strictly trying to develop a Christian framework. Others might point to Augustine and say that Augustine did a similar thing with Plato. And that's where you get the Platonic dualism. And so what the panentheist wants to do is say, what kind of view of God would we come to if we got rid of the God of the philosophers and just considered the issue theologically? And so they argue that a better way of looking at the cosmos is that God sort of develops, or the better way of looking at ultimate reality is to say that God develops with his creation or with the cosmos. And in the words of process theology, God does not create the world out of nothing. Rather, what God does is guide the development of a reality distinct from God, but a reality that has its own existence. And so what you might say with panentheism is that the way you would distinguish this from traditional theism is that on traditional theism, if the creation goes, God still exists as ultimate reality. Whereas on panentheism, if you get rid of the cosmos, God doesn't exist in a way that he could exist outside of the cosmos. God is somehow dependent upon the cosmos for God's existence. So even though God and the cosmos are distinct, it's much like how you would think of our consciousness and our brain. If you get rid of our brain, you get rid of consciousness, where on this view, if you get rid of the cosmos, you get rid of God. So there is a relationship there that can't be separated. Now, where I think some of the process theologians have been helpful in getting us to think differently about God would be specifically in how we think about God's relationship to time. So an interesting discussion at this point would be the discussion between traditional A theory of time versus B theory of time. And the way that we can think about this distinction, so if we're thinking about the A theory of time, and if you ask what is time on this theory, time is the present. So that dot that's moving across your screen right now, that is the only thing that exists on an A theory of time. The present is all that exists. And the dotted line that was left behind is the past. And the dotted line isn't there anymore. And the present is all that exists on an A theory of time. And the future doesn't exist. And so according to process theology, God is experiencing time as it's moving. Which is to say, as the universe is developing, God is developing with the universe. As the universe is changing, God can be learning, according to the process theologian, with the universe because new things are happening. Now, you might say that God still exists outside of the timeline. And if you say that, your view might be more consistent with either open theism or Molinism. So on open theism and Molinism, so these are two different views here. They're not to be conflated with the panentheist view. On open theism and Molinism, God exists outside of time. And we're probably still going to be taking an A theory of time. Some Molinists might disagree with this. And the future doesn't really exist. All that exists is the present. And so the way that this becomes relevant uh, in theology here would be to say that uh, God knows. So if you're talking about God knowing things, the process theologian or the open theist or the Molinist will say that God knows all that is logically possible to know. And God can know the past because the past was something that did exist. So God had an experience of the past, and God can remember that past infallibly. But it might be the case that God doesn't know the future, but that's not a limit on God's knowledge because the future doesn't exist. So an open theist might say, God doesn't know the future, but God is still all knowing, because to say that God is all knowing is just to say that God knows everything that is possible to be known. And if the future doesn't exist, then the future can't be known, and so there's no deficiency in God to say that God doesn't know the future. Process theologian might take this further and say that God is just simply experiencing time as it's going along. So he's not standing outside the timeline, as you see here, but God's experiencing the timeline as it's going. Whereas a Molinist will usually want to say that God does know the future, but the important question is, how does God know the future? From the perspective of the Molinist, God knows the future because God knows the present perfectly. God knows perfectly what happened in the past, and therefore God can predict infallibly what's going to happen in the future, even though the future doesn't exist. Now, you can contrast all of this with somebody who holds to a B theory of time. On a B theory of time, God stands outside of the timeline, and God is directly seeing past, present, and future. In fact, on a B theory of time, what we call the present is just the moment that we as humans are aware of in the moment. That's the present. But if we were able to step outside the timeline, we would see that everything is actually the present from God's perspective. So this is the timeline is all out in front of us. Now, on this view, the reason why this becomes interesting in theology is because it gets really to the question of God, freedom, and time. Is everything determined? Do we have free will? How does God relate to the unfolding events of the universe? And classical theism maintains that God exists outside of the universe and thus can see everything inside the universe, past, present, and future. Now, again, the process theologians and the panentheists have caused us to rethink this. So some people are still classical theists, but you have some people like Molinists who are pretty close to classical theists in that they still think that God exists outside of the universe. They just have a different view of time, that the future doesn't exist yet. All that exists is the present. And so then on this view, if God can see everything that exists inside the universe, then what that means is that all events coming in the future are actually set in place. But here's a problem. At least this is a problem for some. If all events in the future are already set in place, then doesn't that imply that there's no free will? Well, on panentheism and process theology, God does not know the future, at least not by direct observation, and therefore free will is at least possible on this view. And the divine or God is both transcendent and immanent. So to say that God is transcendent is to say that God is beyond the universe or distinguished from the universe. But to say that God is immanent is to say that God is experiencing the universe. So in other words, God can be eternal and temporal at the same time, changeless and changing. And some argue even that God will learn, grow, or risk. Now, if this view is saying that they reject classical theism because it's just the God of the philosophers, someone might ask, well, what brought about this view as a work in theology? And many process theologians will say that this is actually the worldview that is presented in the Hebrew and the Christian scriptures. So, for example, if you go to Genesis chapter 6, 5 through 6, we read this. The Lord, so this was get right around the time right before the flood story in Genesis. The Lord is looking down at the wickedness of humankind and saw that it was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And now here is the key verse for the process theologian or the open theist or for the panentheist. The Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So if you're reading this from the perspective of panentheism or open theism, you might say that it doesn't make sense to say that the Lord was sorry if God was standing outside of the timeline and everything in the timeline was present to him. How could God experience this regret or this feelings of being sorry if he's not experiencing time, if God is not immanent? And so they'll say that this points to a process way of looking at theology. Or you could look at Genesis 22 and verse 12, where the angel of the Lord said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him." And now again, notice this phrase, "For now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son." So again, a process theologian will look at this and say a statement, "For now I know," implies that God learned something. The Lord learned something. Well, how could God learn something if God sees the whole timeline? How could God experience these changes? They would say verses like this indicate that God is experiencing the world as it's unfolding. Or I suppose we could look at one more, Exodus 32. Here Moses is imploring the Lord and said, "O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you've brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Turn from your fierce wrath," and then notice the prayer here, "change your mind and do not bring disaster on your people." And the Lord changed his mind. So this isn't just Moses praying this. The narrator is saying the Lord changed his mind about the disaster that he planned to bring. And again, this is used by the process theologian to say, if God is changing, then God is experiencing or developing with the world. So to summarize just a few different views there for those of you who might be interested, these questions of God, freedom, and time are questions that get debated a lot in some circles. And so I want to just briefly introduce you to 4 views that sometimes come up when trying to figure out how does God relate to free will and time. You have what's called Calvinism, which gets its name from the theologian John Calvin. Many in this tradition would say that every event is determined by God. And so humans have what's called compatibilist free will. So most Calvinists will claim to believe in some version of free will. Now, there are Calvinists that are sometimes called hyper-Calvinists that will just deny free will at all and say there is no free will, humans are just determined. But most Calvinists will embrace what's called compatibilist free will. And compatibilist free will says that you have the freedom to do whatever it is that you want to do. But a Calvinist will also say you have 2 wants inside of you. So when a Calvinist says that you're free to do whatever you want to do, the Calvinist is talking about your ultimate want. And so what are these 2 wants? I like to think about, say, raking the leaves in my lawn. So every fall when the leaves start to fall, before the winter comes, it's really important to rake the leaves in your lawn. Well, every year I don't want to rake the leaves, but every year I do rake the leaves. And so if you ask, well, why did I rake the leaves? Well, a compatibilist view on free will would say the reason why I rake the leaves, even though I say I don't want to, is because I actually have an ultimate want or a deeper want. That is, I want to be responsible. I want to help the lawn for the next year after the snow goes away. So there are these deeper wants that I have that are actually always overriding my superficial wants, such as I don't want to go outside and do work. From a Calvinist perspective, you're free to do your deepest want. But the Calvinist says you're not free to determine what your deepest want is. That is something at the end of the day is determined by God. Now, there is also the Arminian position, which says that God knows all that will happen, but the Arminian says humans have libertarian free will. So the libertarian notion of free will says that there is a way for you to influence your deepest wants. So the libertarian might say that you're not necessarily capable of directly changing your deepest wants. So if, let's use another illustration, going to the gym. If you're not in the habit of going to the gym and working out, well, you can't just overnight make yourself just a completely motivated person who always wants to go to the gym. But the Arminian might say you're free to take one small step and go to the gym today, and you're free to go to the gym tomorrow. And if you repeat the activity over time, eventually your character will develop to such a degree that it'll just be second nature to do that. And so you can't change your deepest desires in a direct instance, but you can make smaller choices that will eventually shape your character. Now, the thing that makes Arminianism and Calvinism similar to each other is both of these views generally assume a B theory of time. So again, the B theory of time says the whole timeline exists in front of God. And so when the Arminian says that God knows all, the Arminian is saying God directly sees everything that is happening right now from an eternal God perspective. But they still want to say that humans have free will. The Calvinist agrees with that. God sees all, but God sees all because God created all. And if God created all, there's no ultimate free will, not in a libertarian sense. Well, two other views that have developed, mainly because of the influence of panentheism and process theology, would be Molinism, as I've already mentioned, and open theism. Now, where the Molinists and the open theists will reject the panentheist view is they'll still hold to theistic dualism. So they don't have a panentheist view. They don't say all is in God. They say that God is ultimate, the creation derives from God, but the Molinists will say that God knows all predictively. So the important question for the Molinists is not, does God know the future? The important question for the Molinists is, how does God know the future? And the Molinist says God knows exhaustively everything that's going to happen in the future, and humans have libertarian free will. Now, the reason why this is important is when you're talking about the relationship between knowledge and freedom, the Molinists, and actually many Arminians will agree with this too, they will point out that to know something is not to be the cause of it. So just to give you one simple example, if I'm watching my 2-year-old son drink Diet Coke, well, I know that he's drinking Diet Coke, but I am not the one causing him to drink Diet Coke. In fact, I don't want him to drink Diet Coke at 2 years old. Now, if I am going to know what my 2-year-old is going to do predictively, that knowledge might go something like this. I put the Diet Coke down on my coffee table. My 2-year-old comes into the room, sees the Diet Coke. Well, I can know predictively what my 2-year-old is going to do in the future after he sees the Diet Coke on the coffee table. Because I know my 2-year-old really well. I know that he's probably going to go over to the coffee table and try to take a drink. But in both cases, my knowledge of what was going on in the moment And also my knowledge of what I'm predicting that my son will do is not the cause of my son doing it. My son is still the one making those choices. Well, the Molinist says to make sense of that relationship between knowledge and causation, we have to have an A theory conception of time. Because if we have a B theory of time, it's hard to say that the timeline exists in front of God's face from an eternal perspective. And so God sees everything that's happening as a present tense for God from God's perspective. And yet to say that I'm really the first cause of any of my actions. How could that be the case if God sees the whole timeline? The Molinist says the way that this could work is that the timeline isn't set. The universe is still unfolding. Yes, God exists outside of the timeline, but this gives the opportunity, at least, for humans to have free will, because when God knows the future, God knows it predictively. There's also a notion in Molinism that God has what's called middle knowledge, and that just means that God sees every possible outcome that could occur in the future, and God knows all of those possible outcomes exhaustively. And then God also knows with his middle knowledge what is going to actually be the thing that occurs. So God knows every possibility that could happen, and then God knows actually what will happen, but that knowledge is predictive. What makes that different from open theism is that on open theism, God does not know every future detail, so humans have libertarian free will. So again, open theists might disagree over exactly what God knows in the future. So most open theists will say that God knows some things that are going to happen in the future, but God doesn't know every future detail. So God might pick out big events that God would know in the Christian tradition. Someone might, if you're an open theist within the Christian tradition, you'd say that God knows prophetic events that are going to come to pass in the future. But that doesn't mean that God knows every detail leading up to those events. So that is an interesting discussion that comes up. I think in many ways was motivated by the influence of process theology, but that's how that discussion influences some of the debates that go on within theistic dualism. Now, the last position that we will consider is idealistic monism. And this position just says that God is all that exists, and whatever we traditionally or typically call matter is nothing more than the perception of God. So the idealist rejects this concept that matter is what's at bottom, and they'll say that what we're seeing all around us right now, so what you're looking at wherever you're watching this, is you're perceiving the thoughts of God. So it's kind of like we're living in the God matrix. God's perceptions are foundational, and we exist inside of the mind of God. Now, there have been some Christian idealists who adopt this view, and they might look at a passage in, say, the book of Acts, where we read, "For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said." So this could be perceived as sort of an idealist view of God. So these are the four views of God. Naturalism, pantheism is one basic worldview. Theistic dualism and deism is within that basic worldview set. Panentheism and idealism. And so if you have any questions about any of these views and you want to email me about those questions, please feel free to do so.